Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to follow up with much of what Patrick said and reinforce it. I fully believe that what we are experiencing is a controlled demolition of both our political and our economic system. And the reason for that, I'm going to go into. To me, what explains that is the fact that most of the measures that are supposedly about public health defy logic and reason and must be unchallenged by any scientist or doctor who has a differing opinion. And I think that, we all understand that a hallmark of tyranny is silencing the opposition. If this were really about public health, we wouldn't be injecting children who have zero risk. We wouldn't be injecting pregnant women who have not been studied. We would be protecting the elderly, and that's it. And this entire crisis, I think, is being used as a cover to do exactly what I said, which is to collapse the system because it's collapsing, and then with the hopes of resetting it so that those who are actually in control right now will retain that control. And I think that it's very, very clear to anybody who's a neutral observer that is what's going on, that there are people who are trying to control this for some reason that's not about public health. I've said this from the very beginning. From January of 2020, this is not about public health, and it's never been about public health. It's about power, money, and control. Now, I want to share a little bit about my background, because while I am the president and founder of Health Freedom Defense, I'm speaking as a private citizen, in particular because I have experience working for Goldman Sachs and Alliance Capital, two of the, when I worked there, two of the most prestigious financial institutions in the world. And the reason that I want to talk about it is because I want to share my experience, because I think it gives a unique insight and perspective to what's happening right now. So first, when I was an investment manager, managed our European growth portfolios, and I was also director of European growth research at Alliance Capital. And my job was to interview the CEOs of multinational corporations. And so I got to see the CEOs and the whole management team of most of the major companies in Europe, and many of those in the US, in particular the ones in which we owned a large chunk. So the reason I'm sharing this is because these management teams would come in and see us and speak with us. And if we were unhappy with what one of the management teams was doing, we were told by our own management, sell the stock, don't own the stock. Don't vote against management. Don't exercise your power as a shareholder. Just choose a different stock. And this is really important because the lay public is led to believe that shareholders act as a kind of check or control on, a balance on management, holding them accountable for their decisions and for their strategy. And the truth is that what's really happening is that the giant investment managers, like I was a part of, are not doing that. They are abdicating that responsibility. They vote along with management. And if they don't vote along with management, then they just sell the stock. So there's this complete absence of this major check and balance that should exist in the system is not actually operating because it's being suppressed in deference to this solitude between the investors and the corporations in which they invest. I think it's a really important thing. It was the exact opposite of what I learned in business school. And I was very, very surprised by it, but it is what you are instructed to do. And now I only work for one big investment manager, but that was my experience in talking to all of the different kinds of investment managers that I worked with, that they were kind of under the same sort of marching orders that, if you don't like it, sell the stock. There essentially is no shareholder activism. And I think that's not well understood by the public. The next thing I want to share is an experience that I had that will, I hope, crystallize for everybody listening what exactly is going on in the minds of these management teams. We were one of the largest shareholders in one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And their blockbuster drug, which was in phase 3 trials, was there were rumors leaking out of their phase 3 trials that there were some problems going on in the phase 3 trials and that a few people had died in the phase 3 trials. And the answer to this wasn't to expose it and discuss it. The answer was something actually very sinister. So what happened was the CEO, the chief financial officer, the head of R&D, head of investor relations, all came into our offices and they went to see all of their big investors. And the point was to go and reassure us that everything was okay. Well, they came in and looked me in the eye and said, listen, in very, very rare instances, this drug that's supposed to help your heart is actually causing a problem in the heart, and a few people have died. And the CEO looked at me and he said, the bad news is the FDA is going to make us put a black box warning on our packaging. The good news is we still think we'll be able to do $7 billion in peak sales. Now, I hope that alarms everybody who's watching, because it certainly alarmed me. And it was the first time in my life I had ever heard firsthand someone be that cavalier about the assessment or the trade-off between human life and corporate profit. And that it was the CEO of the company saying this was very, very eye-opening for me. And it was actually one of the catalysts for me deciding that despite the fact that I had a fantastic career, that I needed to leave. And it was one of the catalysts for me to do so. A couple of years later, I started planning that I was going to leave. It's really important that you understand that backdrop and that context and then apply it to what's happening right now. Because we, as average human beings who care about our families and our friends, we have moral codes by which we lead our lives. We have moral codes, the way, which direct how we interact with other human beings. And it would seem that that moral code is lacking in many of these people that I interacted with who are at the very, very top of the corporate world. And it wasn't just the pharmaceutical industry. It was other areas where corporate management would say, we're quite sure that we're going to get the dam contract in some, developing country. And I came to believe that that's because they had, bribed the politicians in those countries. And so they knew what they were going to get. My point is that I had a front row seat and I have a very uncomfortable taste in my mouth about what happens in those upper echelons of the financial world. So I wanted to say, I'm going to now present some information. That was sort of my introductory remarks. I want to present the information that backs up my assertion and that actually explains the motive, because I think it's so important that a judge and a jury understand the motive behind any alleged crime. And I believe that that's what we're witnessing is a crime. And it's so important to understand that what we're doing or what we're experiencing is the demolition of Western civilization, and why it's happening and why it's happening now and not 10 years ago or 10 years in the future. So with that, let me move to my first slide. Actually, this is not my first slide. This is my first slide. And I want to go to full view, but I don't.
We can see it.
Presentation. Can you see the whole thing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So essentially what's happening is that there is this elite class, politicians, super rich, media, corporations, and they want to retain control of everything that they're doing, of everything that they have. And they're going to lose it because the system is imploding. So they're going to try and destroy it in order to reset it before everything collapses. As Patrick mentioned, I want to re-emphasize that this is about total centralized control of business, assets, natural resources by unelected, unaccountable leaders, ultimately. And we're already seeing that transition. It's been going on in Europe for decades already. What will ultimately occur, I believe, is the creation of a super rich elite who's not accountable, and then a serf class of all of the rest of us. And we will have zero recourse as average citizens because they won't be elected and they won't be accountable to us. And the really burning question that we must all be asking ourselves is why? Why now? Why is this happening? Why did it happen basically in 2020? And I think that the origins go back many, many decades, but this really became a serious problem during the financial crisis that began in 2008, in which we saw financial securitization of loans, homes, and sold off to someone who didn't care. So people were making loans. And in the United States, this crisis was resolved after a few years because the banks in the United States wrote off their bad debts. That did not happen in Europe. But what has happened in the last 8 years since things have sort of slowed down since 2013, 2014, is that the pension crisis has exploded. And the reason that that's happened is because we've had negative to zero interest rates for that entire period. In Europe, we've had negative interest rates. In the US, almost zero interest rates for a very long period of time. And anyone who invests in a bond knows that when you invest in a bond, you want to get the interest. That's the income that you derive from your investment. And pension companies, most of them across the Western world, have to invest mostly in government bonds. So when government interest rates are zero to negative, it means that the yields on their investments are extremely low. Pension funds need to generate about 7 to 8% on average each year in order to service their liabilities. So their liabilities are all the people who've retired. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about public pensions, so not corporate pensions. I'm talking about the public pensions that are guaranteed by European governments or in the United States for people who've worked in any way for a government entity, whether it's a school or a state or something like that. So in the United States, the unfunded pension liability had skyrocketed to $5 trillion by the end of 2018. And that's just the unfunded. So that's the amount of money that pensions owe for all the people who've retired or are going to retire that they don't have money to pay. And so they have to rely on new people coming in, but there's not enough of them. And they're never going to get out of this problem. So that's a major issue. The other major issue is that there's been this explosion in government debt. And in the United States, we went from $1 trillion in 1981 to $30 trillion just a week or 2 weeks ago. I'll show you a chart in a moment, which will put this into context for you. But the really big issue is if you are 65 years old or whatever your retirement age is, and you want to start drawing on your pension, and there's no pension there may be one for you, but what about the next person next year? What's going to happen to these governments when tens of millions of people all over the world wake up and realize that their pensions don't exist, that they are never going to be paid? And so what I would argue is that what is happening is that the central banks, the giant corporations, big tech are all collaborating in order to push everybody into digital currencies and reset the system before that can happen. Let me go to, this is the chart actually of what's happening in US government debt. You can see what's happened, how it has exploded from something that was very, very manageable for many, many decades. I mean, it took 230 years to get us to 1 trillion and then 40 years to get us to 30 trillion. Now, in Europe, you don't have quite as much government debt, but you have a far worse situation with respect to the financial system and to the pension funds. I mentioned that the US banks had written off their bank debt. The Europeans didn't, and they didn't because the entire structure of Europe is different and no one country wants to bail out the next country. So what's happening is that the banks have kept this bad debt on their balance sheets. And there was a financial crisis in October and September of 2019. And what happened was US banks didn't want to counteract in something that's called the overnight window with their European counterparts. And that's because they didn't want what's called counterparty risk. there's this window called the overnight window where banks can park funds. And the US banks didn't want to deal with the European banks like Deutsche Bank because they have huge liabilities for all these bad debts that they haven't written off. And then they've also got huge derivative exposure. And so what happened was the US bank said, we're not going to work with you. And overnight money went to 10%. It's usually very, very close to zero, but it spiked to 10%. And that meant that the Fed had to step in and start backstopping all banks and countries around the world because the situation, the system was on the verge of cracking. And that has not really gone away. And that's why they then, so that's been basically something that's persisted ever since then. But that was a real, shot across the bow that they needed to do something and they needed to do it quickly. That was September, October of 2019. So now turning fully to Europe, as I mentioned, they've had negative interest rates since 2014. And what that means is, as I mentioned, the pensions can't actually meet their liabilities. They're broke. In Europe, 44 trillion euros of unfunded public pensions. That's almost $50 trillion. And the four biggest economies, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, account for 32 trillion of that. That is staggering. There is no way they will ever be able to meet those obligations to, I don't know if it's 100 million Europeans. It's never going to happen. They cannot kick the debt can down the street any further. And this is the reason that I believe that everything is happening. To me, this is the motive for the Great Reset, for using COVID as a cover. Britain itself is about $8.7 trillion. And they're never going to get out of this situation. But there's another piece of it as well, which is that the European Central Bank owns more than 40% of all the outstanding euro national debt in Europe. They don't have a bond market anymore because they destroyed it. So there's no marginal buyer when they have to roll over their debt. They've painted themselves into a corner with their policies. This is what's happened in Europe. It only goes back to 1995 because it's the European Union. Of course, if you went much further back when these countries were not part of the Union, then you would see that it was very, very similar to the US chart. So I want to talk briefly about, I hope that the gravity of that financial situation has been made because it is so serious and it is literally a gun to their heads. They cannot get out of this without destroying the system or resetting it. They need to have a massive debt forgiveness. And what they want to do is tell everybody, we're having a debt holiday for everybody around the world. They're going to default on their debt, and they're going to allow the public to default on their debt. So they'll say it's a holiday. Everyone gets to reset their debt. And the reason that they need control of the system is because, of course, people are going to be very angry when their pensions aren't there. And so they need to get everybody into what's called UBI, Universal Basic Income. And this is the reason, the true explanation for why they are destroying the small and medium-sized businesses, because they can't have people being employed by independent businesses and earning a living. And in the United States, roughly 2/3 of all businesses before COVID were small and medium-sized businesses. They employed 2/3 of the workforce. So if you want to control people and you want to force everybody into a government stipend, universal basic income, you've got to get rid of all of those employers. And this is why none of the measures made sense, that the small and medium-sized businesses couldn't remain open, but Walmart could. It's because of all of this. Now, turning to, I think we really need to understand that there's not just this financial aspect to what's going on, but there's also this corporate and, importantly, a medical complex component to it. And when I say medical complex, I mean the pharmaceutical industry, of course, but I also mean the hospital systems, the NGOs, the research institutions, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and very importantly, the giant foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros's foundation. These groups siphon millions and millions of dollars every single year to the colleges and universities. The NIH and other governmental institutions siphon millions and millions of dollars to these same groups. They actually siphon money to the journals. The journals are not independent. And so basically what you have is complete control of what is published, what is censored, what is written. So in the journals, what is published is dictated by the same people. In the research, the research that is conducted at the universities and research hospitals is dictated by NIH and these giant foundations. The universities teach what is dictated as well. And then you have, just to give you an example, the University of Washington is very near to Bill Gates's home, and he gives them unbelievable amounts of money. The Gates Foundation authorized a grant of $279 million in 2018 to the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. This institute is one of the big institutes that was putting out the terrifying models that millions and millions of people were going to die from COVID. Another one of the big institutions, which I'm sure many people know about, is Imperial College. Imperial College took $79 million from the Gates Foundation. I believe it was January of 2020, and $133 million in the couple of years leading up to that. This is a massive operation, and it's only happened because of this, because basically the medical complex has been brought under the fold of these people at the very, very top. The same thing applies to the media and to politics. If you look at politics in the United States, pharma is the biggest lobbyist, $250 million a year. They are the biggest donors. Literally 9 out of 10 US congresspersons take money, and 97% of US senators have taken money from pharma. They have twice as many lobbyists in Congress as there are members of Congress. And then when we drill down to what's going on with the media, I cannot emphasize enough this second to the last bullet point. The pharmaceutical and healthcare industries spend $35 billion annually on advertisements globally. They own every major media outlet because they are the lion's share of their advertisements rather. If you look in the United States, just digital ads alone are $10 billion. And if you look at, what's going on, you think, well, I should trust my doctor. But the truth is that the doctors are beholden as well, because the journals tell them what to believe. And so do their societies like the American Medical Association or the American Academy of Pediatrics, which take millions and millions of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. And much of what physicians have to do in terms of continuing medical education credits is funded by the pharmaceutical industry itself. So how are they going to do this? I'm going to run through this very quickly. I mentioned universal basic income. I've mentioned central bank digital currency. They need total control of finance, the economy. They need total control of everybody. And they're going to do it through currency. This is why they're tracking transactions, eliminating the small and medium-sized employers, and putting caps on cash. So one of the big components of this is getting rid of cash. They've got to destroy cash. And they're doing all that they can and have been for several years in order to plant the seed that cash is dirty. That came out of China in the beginning of January. Remember, they were talking about how it carries the virus. In Australia, they've been saying for years that cash is for criminals. They've been putting caps on any kind of transaction. So you can't spend more. I think in Europe, it's down to a few thousand euros now that you can actually conduct a cash transaction. In the United States, it's still around 10,000, and in Australia as well, but they are restricting and capping cash-based transaction. And even more importantly, they're actually outright canceling cash. Justin Trudeau signed some kind of a order at the beginning of 2021, I believe it was, allowing him to cancel the currency at will. And he's already ensued with canceling large denominations. We've seen the same thing in other countries, and in India, we're seeing similar things as well. So there's this, there's this massive agenda, I believe, occurring as a result of all of the financial imperatives. and they are using all the tools available to them in order to implement it. One of the big things that they are going to use to actually implement this control system, and it was, the video talked about the Internet of Bodies, is low Earth orbit satellites, which are being shot into space all over the world. Elon Musk's Starlink has, I think, placed 1,700, and Bill Gates has somewhere around 500. But basically, the idea is to blanket the Earth in surveillance that is live every single square inch, so that there is no escape and that they have total control of humanity. I won't really go into this. Patrick kind of touched on this, but basically we've already seen, 2 years ago, we said that there were vaccine passports coming, and everybody said that we were conspiracy theorists. And, we've got these digital identifications and the merger between identification, medical records, financial records, voting ID, travel records. All these things are all being merged into these passes. It's not about health. It's not about a vaccine passport. It's getting you to accept that you give over all of your information to the people who control the system. And I think it's really important to nail that, reemphasize that there is extraordinary technology. They've already implanted chips in people's hands, which connect to their vaccine records and to their to their financial records and to their employment records. And there's already nanotechnology that's been injected into animals that can control their behavior, monitor their brains and their bodily functions. The bottom line is, just to wrap up, I'm sorry I've gone sort of fast, but I know I have 20 minutes and there's so much to say. There is essentially no way out of the financial mismanagement that has occurred at the hands of these leaders. There has never been any intention of repaying all the debt that they have borrowed and issued. There's never been any intention of coming true on all of the promises that they have made to hundreds of millions of employees all over the world. And they have no way out of the situation that they have created themselves, aside from canceling all the debt, resetting the entire system, and getting all of us to accept living in Klaus Schwab's dystopian future. And so I hope that this testimony helps people to understand that there is a dire financial situation, which I believe is a very, very clear motive for these people to have done all of these crimes against humanity in the last 2 years, so that they can retain control of the system, the power that they have, and live lives of luxury while they enslave the rest of us. Thank you very much for your time and for inviting me to participate in this, this incredible proceeding, along with these. It's been a true honor with these esteemed other colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie. This is brilliant. It's an eye-opener, not just for us, but I hope for the entire world, for the jury. Essentially, they are with their backs against the wall. Isn't that true?
To understand, to put some of these things in context, the amount of pension liability that European countries have, I think Luxembourg and Belgium are something like 4 or 5 times the national GDP. That's how much they owe just to the public for the pensions. There is no way out of this situation. They will never be able to repay it, just like the U.S. will never be able to repay $30 trillion in national debt. There's no way. And if you look at what's happened I didn't even go into Australia, Canada, Japan, they're all in the same situation. The UK as well. If you look at just the US, Japan, Europe, and I think the UK, the central banks of those countries have spent $9 trillion, which is an increase of, I think, if I remember correctly, 50% of what they had spent in history up until that point. Wow. There is just no way for them to fix this. And so what they will likely do is create what are called perpetual bonds, where and George Soros has already sent out newsletters to his readership that he recommends that this happen. He's already publicly called on Macron of France to create perpetual bonds. And so what they will do is, if you have an investment in a government bond, they will say, your government bond, we're not paying it back in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. It's now a perpetual bond that will go away when you die. And we will pay you a nominal interest rate on it until you die. So you'll get 2% or 3%, but you'll never get your money back. This is one of the ways. So they have to do everything that they can to placate the populace, because otherwise the populace is going to do some very, very horrible things. They are going to drag these people out in the streets. If history is any measure as to what happens when people have been lied to and robbed blind for decades by their political leaders.
So is this an oversimplification, or is it correct when I say that the debt that they've issued, in return for the debt that they've issued, they've taken our assets and our money?
They have stolen everything that Western civilization has created, essentially. That $30 trillion in debt went into someone's pocket, right? And whose pockets has it gone into the most? The people at the top, whether it's a defense contractor or a pharmaceutical industry. I mean, I think that the US government gave $10 billion to the pharmaceutical industry to create these COVID injections. And now they're making tens of billions of dollars, but we'll never be repaid that. They are buying off school systems. They're buying off the universities. They're buying off. So yes, this money has been issued. It's been created out of thin air and put on the backs of the taxpayers. So we have been robbed of all of our future earnings and our future productivity in order to keep the people who are in power, who have created this catastrophe, this financial and political catastrophe, from being held accountable. Because they know darn well what's going to happen when people realize that they have no intention of ever meeting their promises or obligations. You know, if you look, Reiner, at what's happened in the US, we have more federal national debt than we do unfunded public pensions. In Europe, they've been promising the people, oh, we're going to give you these unbelievably generous retirement programs. So there's this imbalance. If you look, the US has super high federal national debt, and in Europe, they have super high pensions. In the US, we have lower pension liabilities, and Europe has lower federal debt obligations. But if you look at them in aggregate, they're very, very similar amounts. Yeah. They are broke. Yeah. They've been promising people for decades that we're going to give you these generous retirement benefits, and they don't have the money to do so. So, listen, at some point, the buck stops somewhere, right? I don't know if you have the saying all over the world, but at some point, the chickens come home to roost. And basically, that's what's happening. There is no further way to extend this. They've got to do something before they actually start defaulting. And countries are very close to defaulting on their debt. And once that happens, there will be this, spread. It will just spread all over the world. And they have to prevent that from happening.
So, in other words, the small window of opportunity that Klaus Schwab talks about really means it's a euphemism for we've got to run or else they're going to catch us.
100%. Mm-hmm. I think that this financial piece reinforces everything that Patrick said about them talking about, the window of opportunity. And I think that they're really struggling because I think that they gave themselves roughly 2 years to achieve this. And that's up. 2 years to achieve it before 2022. Because otherwise, if they didn't have everybody jabbed, if they didn't have everybody in the system, if everybody was not implanted with something to control them, if they didn't have a digital ID to access the internet and to control their health and their participation in society, then they didn't have enough control to force the last few percent who haven't complied into it. And that's where we are. So I think that the wheels are starting to come off. And what's going on in Canada, if we need proof that what has happened around the world in the last 2 years is not about public health, all I have to say is one word, and that is Canada.
Yeah.
They have invoked martial law. They are arresting people for exercising their constitutionally protected right to protest peacefully, to demonstrate peacefully. They are freezing their bank accounts and their assets. This is not about public health. This is about maintaining control. So I think that is evidence that there is a crack in this dam, and they are going to struggle very, very hard to manage the situation.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I don't want to cut anyone off, so please, Dexter and Virginie and Anna.
I would like to jump in. I have a couple of questions. Leslie, what an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One of the things that hasn't really been discussed, at least from the financial standpoint, is this agenda that some people are aware of, that there's also a depopulation component to this. I can understand how with the debt regarding pensions, how the elderly or post-pensioners would be targeted, perhaps. What befuddles me is, why would they target, in some ways, the children and the unborn? As we know, the pregnant women receiving this injection have super high levels of miscarriages, and there was a large study about that. And the children who are at no risk of dying from COVID are being injected with a much greater risk of dying from the injection. So not that it's acceptable to kill off the elderly to avoid facing that debt, but it seems to me that the other would be so counterproductive even to these pathological agendas that they have. Do you have any comment about that?
I think it's a very, very interesting issue, Anna. Listen, we know that they were using deadly drugs in the UK, literally, killing the elderly. We know in the US that they've been denying them treatments. It's a very peculiar situation that they are doing this to young people. But, Klaus Schwab has said, and Bill Gates has talked about the problem of population. It is no secret to anybody that these people involved with the World Economic Forum have a depopulation agenda. And so I think that they have such hubris as well, that they believe that they should decide who reproduces. And there is evidence for this. I'm sure Patrick knows more about it than I do, but there is evidence for this. There is, much of the World Economic Forum, much of the people involved, Bill Gates' family, they go back to, they're connected to the Nazi regime and to the original eugenicists. The UN is tied into that. Everybody knows about the book Brave New World, which was written by Aldous Huxley, but his brother, Julian Huxley, was instrumental in UNESCO. And I think that that's a big part of it. And so this is why so much of this, perhaps, listen, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to, I can't give you references off the top of my head, but I do know that Bill Gates' father was involved with Planned Parenthood. He was a eugenicist. Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, talked about that the most compassionate thing that a large Black family could do was to kill some of their young, stop having babies. These people have very, very sick motivations. And so, again, I think it's important. I think I said this earlier. It's so important to understand that most of us are decent, kind, compassionate, honest, loving human beings who want what's best for our fellow human beings. But there's a percentage of the population who don't think like we do. And it's very hard for us to get inside their minds. because we don't think like them and because it's unconscionable. What they do is unconscionable to us, to any of us who have a shred of decency in our hearts. And so, Anna, I mean, it's speculation, but I think that it served their overall agenda of reducing the population. They are very concerned. And listen, if you wanted to rule the world, do you want to have to try and control 10 billion people, or do you want to try and control, I don't know, 5 billion or 500 million? I think that's probably the explanation. And then I think there's also an explanation that may not be sinister at all. And that is that they are injecting things into us and they have no idea what it's going to do to people. Maybe they do, but let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they are pushing these things without clear evidence of what they cause. Maybe they just didn't realize what it was going to do to reproduction. Maybe they didn't know. And so maybe that is their explanation. I don't fully buy that because the distribution studies that were leaked out of Japan, the biodistribution studies showed that the lipid nanoparticles were accumulating in excessive amounts in the ovaries. But that could be a less, just a more innocent explanation.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Thank you.
But I mean, the strange thing, if we think about, like, if it's the incompetence theory, then it's strange that once these more and more hints with regard to the problems, like especially with regards to fertility, are not being taken seriously. I mean, that's kind of weird, because otherwise, okay, if you'd gone the wrong way, then maybe you would now need to come forward and say, we're awfully sorry, we have to do something about it, have to stop that, like with pregnant women, or like also the toddlers or whoever they target now. I mean, that's not explainable, I think.
Viviana, I agree with you 100%. There is no way to explain the tens of thousands of deaths that have been reported to the CDC and to the European Medicines Agency, and yet these products persist in being on the market. There's no explanation that is innocent. There is not. I totally agree with you. I was just trying to say, listen, if you want to try and make some kind of innocent explanation, there's no explanation for spending $30 trillion. There's not, because obviously there's no way to ever repay that. It's not possible. There's no way to promise all the promises. It's always been about politics and power with no intention of ever coming good on their promises. So any thinking person has to conclude that what's happening is a global coup. That's it. It's a global coup. And, I'm sure people will lambaste me as some kind of a conspiracy theorist or something, but there is no innocent explanation to what is happening around the world right now. None. If everything that was happening was innocent, they would have stopped all of the spending. They wouldn't have silenced all the doctors and scientists. They wouldn't have given this to innocent children and pregnant women. They wouldn't have done anything that they've done. They would have taken these off the market. There would not be this. They wouldn't have changed the definition of pandemic. They wouldn't have changed the definition of a vaccine. They wouldn't have done all the things that they've done if there was an innocent explanation.
I agree.
Can I throw a question back in, Reiner?
Sure.
Leslie, you might have mentioned the word derivative along the way in your presentation. I think I heard that.
Yes.
But could you expand just a little bit more on this? The Bank for International Settlements estimates, this was 2000, well, this was a year ago. They estimated that the total notional value of the derivatives market in the world now is, let me get the number right, estimated to be $610 trillion. And the function of the derivatives market almost destroyed the financial system back in 2008 when Lehman Brothers went south and caused a global shock wave, and all these derivative contracts started to be called or triggered, and it almost put the giant insurance company AIG out of business. The claims that were being lodged against them for these derivative triggers. This market now is almost twice as large as it was in 2008, the derivatives market. It's a number that's, we can't calculate it. I mean, who knows, $610 trillion. But seems to me to be a sword hanging over our head that nobody really pays attention, maybe because it's so hard to understand what derivative is in the first place. But do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, Patrick, it's such a complex issue, and most people don't even understand. A derivative is it's hard to explain. I mean, some people don't even understand what a stock or a bond is, and a derivative is something that derives its value on that underlying instrument, but it has components of time and volatility and other components that play into its value. And the reason I'm unpacking it a little bit is so that people have at least a little bit of an understanding of what it's about. And it is literally a sword of Damocles hanging over everybody. And here is how it would work. $600 trillion is, beyond any of us to even comprehend how big that is to the financial markets. I can't remember off the top of my head how big global government bond markets are or stock markets, but I do know that global bond markets are about 5 times that of the stock market. And this number, derivatives, dwarfs the global bond markets. And the reason it's so important is because what happens is when a bank or a corporation issues a bond or a government issues a bond, what will happen is, and this is why there was a mortgage problem, is that the bank issues the loan to a borrower, and then the bank sells the loan to somebody else. And then that other person, that other player took those loans, packaged them together, said that they are all super high investment grade investments, and packaged them and sold them to the public. And what happened was people started to realize that this was junk, literally junk. It wasn't investment grade at all. And it threatened to take down the entire financial system. And now we're at $600+ trillion in derivatives. And those same factors are at play. But it's worse because it's not just in the United States or in Europe. Now, what's been happening for the last 10 or 15 years is that the emerging market countries have been issuing debt in dollars. Okay? They've been issuing it in dollars. They have to pay it back in dollars. If one of them defaults, or if you see one of these derivative agreements default, where someone has bought a put, which is an option to sell a bond, if one of those things collapses, you will have a contagion that is global that will bring everything to its knees. And so it's another way that 2 things are happening. One is they're keeping the system going through these derivatives, and 2, they make extraordinary amounts of money because people just pay them to buy options or a derivative on these underlying assets. And so if one little domino falls, the whole house of cards will come down. So I know I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, but it's a really, really important issue that would take a long time to really unpack. And frankly, I'm not as up to speed on every single aspect of how it plays out in the markets today. But I can tell you that it is something that would create a huge problem around the world if you just saw one thing. And there is evidence of this in the past. I mean, I was in the financial markets in what was called the long-term capital management crisis, which was the smartest guys in the room. It was all these super mathematical geniuses who created models to invest, and they were investing in Russia, saying that they would never, ever default. And what happened was, actually, there was a default, and then it was contagious in all these other markets. The same thing happened. We also saw an Asian market crisis contagion. And so, to your point, when you've got that amount of money, which is not on anybody's balance sheet, no one is recognizing the risk or accounting for it anywhere. If one or two of those things go down, and this is the exact reason why the US banks wouldn't deal with Deutsche Bank, because they had so much derivative exposure, trillions of it. I forget what the amount was that Deutsche Bank had, but they said, we're not going to deal with you anymore, because they knew that it was a house of cards waiting to collapse. And all it's going to take is one bank somewhere or one country somewhere to collapse, which will trigger a massive contagion all over the world.
Thank you for directing our attention that way too. I think it was over 70 trillion back then, and maybe it's down to 40 trillion. Björn probably knows better than I do. Dexter and Virginie, you wanted to ask questions.
Yeah, I've got Leslie. I just want to say thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Yes. You have definitely clarified the evidence, specifically in relation, and you've very beautifully built up with what Mr. Hood has presented when it comes to technocracy and then ultimately sustainable development. In your opening, you have mentioned the following, and that is that there is no shareholder activism. So I would like us to focus specifically, what does this mean in respect to the pharmaceutical companies? And the pharmaceutical companies I'm making reference to is the COVID-19 pharmaceutical companies.
It's a very interesting question, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out as more evidence of fraud in the clinical trials does come out. There have been allegations of fraud in the Pfizer clinical trials, as we all know, I think that was revealed by Project Veritas. But essentially, shareholder activism is, the way that a corporation is structured is that it borrows money from debt, but also it finances itself through investments in the form of stock. So the very large investment managers have a role to play in terms of holding management accountable to having sound strategy, investing their capital, because it's their capital. If you invest in the stock of a company, you own a piece of the company, okay? And it's your job and your right to require that management of those corporations actually manage the company to maximize your interests as a shareholder. What is happening is that element of shareholder activism is gone because all of the giant institutions are not asking corporations, holding their feet to the fire. Now and then you will see a corporate raider come in who will buy the company on the cheap and throw out management and then sell off the assets. Okay. I mean, people have heard about those corporate raiders in the past, but that doesn't really happen anymore. Now, when we turn specifically or it doesn't happen very often. And I would say as well, Dexter, it's very important to say that not that there's no shareholder activism, but it is not very widespread. And that for the most part, it is my belief that the major investment institutions that are investing in corporations in the stock market are not actually actively giving criticism and really holding management's feet to the fire. They will sell the stock if they don't like what management are doing, but that's not enough. They should be, actively harassing them if they think that they're doing crazy, pursuing crazy strategies. And what's very interesting, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, is Moderna. Who are the investors in Moderna? I don't know every single one, but I do know that Bill Gates is a big investor. I do know that there are other major insiders in it. And so there is zero incentive for them to act as activist shareholders. And there was also very little incentive for them to hold them accountable if there was anything awry in their clinical trials. When it comes to Pfizer, it will be very, very interesting to see how that plays out, because there have been these allegations of fraud by someone who was involved with the clinical trial itself. And if I were a major investor in Pfizer, I would want to be investigating this and finding out what exactly happened, because you could actually sue them. We saw in the Enron scandal that they were ultimately sued for fraud. And so that is something that could actually happen. And, if the allegations that have been made so far are correct, then they absolutely should be held responsible. And there has been fraud. The big problem here is that the amount of assets that are held now by BlackRock and Blackstone and Vanguard, and I'm forgetting the other really big one, they are so big. I mean, they make AIG look like a little flea in terms of too big to fail. And so they literally own a huge portion of the system. And it is very unlikely, in my opinion, that they would do anything to hold these people accountable because they are actually in on what's going on. And the reason I say they're in on it is that they've been buying up houses. You know, BlackRock allegedly bought 20,000 houses in Florida. They're buying up full neighborhoods in Texas. This really speaks to the Klaus Schwab promise that you will own nothing and be happy, and it will all be owned by the people at the top. So I hope that answers, your question.
You have clarified it. So what I want to get into now is that I want to get into the shareholders. And my question that I want to pose to you, when it comes to the United States CDC, the NIH, and the FDA specifically. And here, I'm actually also looking specifically at Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is NIAID director of NIH. Do they have any shares in any of this C-19 vaccines, pharmaceutical companies? Are you aware of it?
Yes, absolutely. So I didn't go into all of this because it's, you could talk about it for hours, but basically what we are seeing is that there has been a wholesale takeover of the medical complex by these special interests for the past 110, 15 years. And there were two really pivotal things that happened. One, in 1980, there was a bill passed in Congress called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act allowed those who work for government and conduct research funded by taxpayers to begin to retain some of the intellectual property rights to those patents that they develop. And Anthony Fauci's AID developed the Moderna vaccine, essentially. They developed it, and many of the people who work for him, including himself, own patents on the Moderna vaccine. And yes, they can earn $150,000 per year per patent. That's my understanding. So if they have patents in other companies as well. So I don't know if they actually have stock ownership, but they have a financial vested interest. But I think you're getting at an even more important thing, Dexter, and that is that there is a revolving door and an extremely intricate web of finance between the FDA, the CDC, NIH, NIAID, and industry. FDA, the drug approvers at FDA, 60% of their, I forgot to talk about one other thing. I said there were two things. There was the Bayh-Dole Act, and then there was something called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and that was passed in 1992. And that's very important because what it did was it set up a system to allow the pharmaceutical industry to have their drugs fast-tracked through the FDA approval process in order to get drugs for unmet medical needs to the market rapidly. And what's happened is it started out as like $100 million a year. I think it's $1.3 billion this year. And it amounts to about 45% of FDA's entire budget. If you look at just the drug approvers, the pharmaceutical industry pays about 60% of their salaries. In addition, if you look at the person who was the head of the CDC for 8 years, Dr. Julie Gerberding, she left after Obama left office. She left and she went and she headed up Merck vaccines globally, making millions and millions of dollars. Scott Gottlieb, who used to be, I can't remember, I think he was CDC or was he FDA? He's on the board of Pfizer now. There is a revolving door between these people who go from NIH, CDC, or FDA into industry. But on top of that, there are purse strings. So if you look at, like, as I mentioned, the FDA is beholden to the drug companies that it's supposed to regulate. And it's even worse than that, because not only is FDA beholden, but so is CDC. There is something called the CDC Foundation, which is a public-private partnership. And essentially, the pharmaceutical industries and the foundations like the Gates Foundation and others give millions and millions of dollars to the CDC. The CDC and NIH both own patents on vaccines as well. So they have another vested interest. So the point is that it's not just about ownership and stock. It is a mass web of conflicts of interest and financial interests at every level of the regulatory agencies and the pharmaceutical industry and the medical complex. And so then if you look at, what happened during the last years of crisis, the hospitals were told under the PrEP Act, if you do what CDC instructs you to do, meaning if you follow our COVID protocol, you cannot be sued by anybody. You have no liability. You can't be sued. But if you deviate and you prescribe ivermectin, for instance, then you can be sued. So the hospital system is controlled as well. And then if you look at the grants, the budget from NIH, I have a slide on it, but I think Fauci's own NIAID budget is somewhere in the $4 to $5 billion, but NIH's whole budget, which he has a huge say on, is about $40 billion. That is what funds the research at the universities, the hospitals, all across the nation and the world. And so if you're a scientist or you're a doctor and you're wanting to explore something that goes against something that the government policy supports, you will not get funding. Or if you publish something that contradicts government policy, you will lose your funding. So they have a mechanism to shut down research and control what comes out. And then I mentioned that the pharmaceutical industry essentially controls the journals as well.
So in short, one can then clearly say, based on the evidence that you have just given, that when it comes to the CDC, the NIH, the NIAID, and the FDA, there's clearly a conflict of interest. And they have a vested interest in this pharmaceutical C-19 vaccines.
Dexter, I would go further. I would say, yes, there is absolutely a conflict of interest, but I would say it's even worse than that. They are fully captured industries, fully captured agencies by the industry they are supposed to regulate.
Okay. So my final question that I want to put to you, at the beginning of your evidence, you've actually painted a very clear picture. And the picture that you've actually painted was to the extent as to why you left as an investment manager at the time. And that is that you were shocked when, and I believe it's one of the CEO of one of the guys or ladies in power, when they came to you, looked you in the eye, and informed you, yes, the FDA has got a problem. However, they are going to stick a black sticker on the medicine. But that, I can tell you, and that's basically just paraphrasing, that that does not even bother us, because the good news is that we will still be able to make billions and billions. So having said that, and that is now evidence that is on a record, I would like you now to tell the jury, based on that specific experience of yours, when it comes now, and what is currently happening is that Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, what they are currently doing. And I believe that the audience are aware of it. And in a sense, it is common knowledge. They are but only now starting to stick warning signs on the vaccines. It can cause myocarditis, it can cause pericarditis, and so forth and so forth. But that in itself does not even stop the rollout. Will you say, based on the scenario that you've actually sketched at the beginning, is that exactly the same as to what you see, that even if the sticker is on the vaccines, it still does not hamper them? And will you then, as a follow-up question, say the only solution to stop these vaccines is for the FDA, the CDC, to say this is toxins, it has to be stopped as a matter of urgency? Can you please just clarify that and bring it within the context that I've stipulated? Thank you.
Yes. So to the first question, Dexter, the situation is very, very similar. Yes, it is. The FDA requires this little black box and it's a warning. And it basically says then that the onus is on you. You've taken the drug, you took it voluntarily, and here's the warning. If you don't pay attention to the warning, then that's your problem. So it is a way to keep the money machine rolling without taking it off the market and with putting the pressure on the individual who makes the choice. Ultimately, there still can be lawsuits, as we saw with Vioxx and other things, but other drugs. But this is people have to understand that the pharmaceutical industry in the last 20 years, Public Citizen released information that they have paid $35 billion in fines just in the last 10 or 15 years, I think it is the time frame. These are not benign, well-meaning corporations. These are peddlers of toxins. Literally, the vast majority of this stuff is not of use to the public. What is useful to the public is exercise and eating well and supplementing and managing stress levels and sleeping. I'm actually a healthcare practitioner as well. I'm a qualified homeopath, and but the pharmaceutical industry doesn't make any money. And so when I said that this whole takeover of the medical complex goes back over 100 years, what I meant is it goes back to something called the Flexner Report, which was a report that was commissioned by Rockefeller and Carnegie themselves to smear all of the natural forms of medicine that have been around for centuries and in some cases millennia, 5,000 years for acupuncture, to get rid of them in order to install this chemical and pharmaceutical-based paradigm. I think that, so yes, 100%, what we are experiencing right now is parallel to what I experienced a little over 20 years ago in that conference room. And I think that the only way it's going to get a lot worse is if there's some kind of a class action lawsuit or something major or something breaks to expose that there has been more fraud. I think expecting FDA to do the right thing is not going to happen right away. So, that addresses the black box warning. And then the other part of your question, I actually can't, can you refresh my memory as to what exactly you were, so I focus on that?
How do you stop this?
How do we stop it?
You're muted, Dexter.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the second part of the question is related to FDA. The best for them, and you've actually, in a sense, you've actually answered it in your last sentence, is that they're supposed to actually stop it as a matter of urgency. So can you comment on that?
Yes, they are supposed to
answer, but if you want to elaborate, you're more than welcome.
Listen, I think that the answer to all of our problems is local control. Okay, everywhere around the world, in our own communities, we need our own currencies. We need our own independent healthcare systems. And I'm not saying that modern medicine can't be part of it, but it should be about all of the holistic practitioners. They are harmless and they are extremely beneficial and efficacious. They are just being smeared and silenced by the medical complex that controls everything that we have all been talking about. So to me, the true answer is we need our own newspapers, because the Gates Foundation gave $1 billion to the media in the first decade of the 20th century. These media outlets are all controlled. We need to basically create local control, and we need to get rid of all of the changes that have made to our constitutions and founding documents, because our founding documents are extremely profound and I think right on in most cases. They've just been bastardized over the past decades and centuries. So to me, the answer is to push back. And we push back locally by holding our local politicians accountable, our school boards, and everybody else, and saying, no, we are not going to participate in this anymore. And one word of caution I would say, Dexter, is that, as I said in the beginning, I do not believe that what we are experiencing is about public health or has ever been about public health since the very beginning. I think it's about implementing a system of control so that those in power stay in power. And they can only do that if they have centralized power. So if we start to take it back in our own communities, they lose the power that they have. To me, that is the answer.